Welcome to Therapy Unplugged, the podcast where two therapists offer insights to the real-life issues we all experience. We are your hosts, Sarah Benoit and Megan McCullough.
So welcome back, listeners. It is Megan here with Sarah. Hey, Sarah.
Hi, Megan. Hi, everyone.
We're so glad to be back in the studio recording again. And today, our topic is self-compassion and the practice of self-compassion. And I think, Sarah, for me, the reason why I thought this would be a really good topic to delve into is just like I think with all of our episodes, we can kind of find these common threads between them. And I've experienced in my own life and certainly with clients that when they come to me in session, I often find that the practice of just being kind to yourself, and gentle and understanding is sometimes not there. It is not something that always comes naturally to us. And, it might, I think we could probably both agree with this, but tell me if you do or you don't. I think that when life is going well, it's obviously easier to feel good about ourselves or to be gentle with ourselves. But when life goes wrong, or when we make mistakes, or when we fumble, when we fail, that self-compassion or just that kindness to oneself often goes out the window. And I think that we are doing ourselves almost like an injustice when we look at our mistakes and our failures through this very harsh, critical view. So I'll hand it over to you and just get your
Yep.
general thoughts on it, but that's kind of where I think I'm coming from anyway with this episode.
Yeah, I want to really piggyback on that because I think you bring up really good point, which is when things are going well, we're more positive. We generally have a better outlook and we are better at letting things kind of roll off our backs or whatnot. And I think that for me where kind of self-compassion really is more. I think it's about it, and it's not easy to get there for some because I think again to your point, this is made for some, maybe something they have to learn or
Mhm.
rehearse. But ultimately, I like to view it as a state of being or a state of mind.
Hmm.
And saying that means that, like, not just I could tell you, like, there's a lot of people, myself included, where you can intellectually understand something, and you can speak to it, and you can support it, but then when it comes into practice, it's kind of a whole different ballgame.
Right.
And I think that is one of the things about the self-compassion is at least this viewpoint that I'm taking, is we really need to embody it. And so going back to that example of when things are good, so if you think of when things are going well, our self-critic is probably pretty quiet.
Mhm.
And but when things aren't going well,
Right.
it's probably raging. And oftentimes, like, it's not kind. It's not encompassing, meaning, that critical voice might have tunnel vision, and it's thinking it's or saying to ourselves, like, "Oh my gosh, why didn't I do better?" Or the shoulda, coulda, wouldas.
Yeah.
And I think to your point too around self-compassion, for me, it can start as self-care because you may have to be very intentional about it. But I like to think that we get to a point where it's more a state of our being, and it's
Hmm.
just really interwoven and integrated into everyday life.
I love that idea. Can you imagine if we could just kind of live our lives through that lens?
Oh, it'd be so easy.
Yeah, right. Right, right. Yeah, and I Another thing that's kinda coming to me right now is that I think that this practice is so important because, and I know we certainly talked about this in our last episode on leaning into discomfort,
Mhm.
but failure and mistakes are a part of the human experience.
Exactly.
There's just no getting around it, and so if we you know, if mistakes are part of the human experience, and I would say they happen a lot,
Mhm.
I really, and again, I'm speaking personally, but also certainly professionally and having, getting to know my clients. But if this is something that we experience throughout our lifetime, why wouldn't we want to find an approach to the mistake or an approach to whatever we perceive as our failures or fumblings, an approach that actually can help us expand and grow and learn from our mistakes rather than what I think often happens when we make a mistake, we go to that very dark place of
Yeah.
you fill in the blank, right? But it kind of like, talking to your oneself as if you're, how could I be so stupid? How could I have missed that? How could I have failed? Just that very kind of harsh voice, which I think ends up constricting us
Mhm.
more than motivating us to
Yes.
make changes if we feel that changes need to happen.
Agreed. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Sarah, in preparing for this episode, one name that did come up a lot for me, and I certainly want to give credit to her with some of the things that I'm going to bring up today. There is a woman by the name of Dr. Kristin Neff.
Mhm.
And Kristin Neff is a researcher and she's an associate professor of educational psychology at the University of Texas in Austin. And she's the founder of the Center for Mindful Self Compassion. She also has an amazing website that we will certainly put in the show notes that is just chock full of different practices, different guided meditations, just a lot of absolutely free material out there for the taking on this subject of self compassion. So I did want to mention her. And one of the things that I really like about her work, or that I at least resonate with myself, is that she breaks down self compassion into three basic components.
Mhm.
And so I'm just going to start with the first one and then I'll hand it back over to you.
Sure.
So the first basic component is self-kindness. But what she does is she then kind of puts the opposite of that, which is what I think a lot of us tend to go to. So for her, it's self-kindness versus self-judgment,
Mm.
right? So, being kind to ourselves when we suffer, being kind to ourselves when we fail, being kind to ourselves when we feel inadequate doesn't come naturally. What
Mhm.
does come naturally is just this very kind of harsh self criticism. And what she puts forth is that we practice being warm and supportive when confronted with our imperfections rather than cold or harsh.
Mhm.
And she brings up this practice, this exercise, I should say, that I know I've used before. I tweak it a little bit, but one of the components of her work is this practice of when we make a mistake, we think about, say, our best friend,
Mhm.
and we think about the idea that our best friend made this mistake, and you kinda go through in your mind, "What would I say to this friend of mine?" Right? Like, if my friend came to me upset, if like, Sarah, if you came to me and just you shared something you were upset about, how would I respond to you? And then I would compare that to how I might respond to myself internally,
Mhm.
um, if I was confronted with the same thing. And it's pretty interesting when we start doing that. The tweak that I often make, I've done this with myself, and I have asked this question to a lot of my clients that are upset with something that's occurred that they've done that they again are viewing as a failure or a mistake is I will often ask, if this was your child, or if you don't have children, just if this was a small child that you knew and loved, and they came to you with they were upset about something, how would you respond to your child or a child?
Mm.
And hopefully, anyway, we would naturally respond in a loving and warm way. And so then you take that warm, loving way and you start to kind of like practice it with yourself.
I like how you use the idea of a small child or a child, because as you were talking, I was thinking, I mean, this is essentially kind of what we're talking about here is a strategy. And
Mhm.
it's, what that was one of the things that came up in my research as well is, okay, and I say this to people, I'll say, Is this how you would talk to your best friend or to your loved one?" But I think depending on the space someone's in, they could, especially if it's an adult loved one, they could still be harsh with them because we're often
Mhm.
worse to those that we feel the safest with.
Sometimes, yep.
But I love the idea of a child because I think, like you said, I hope that adds a different layer and a different lens to it. A small child is going to, if we're harsh and critical, is going to take that to heart, and they're gonna blame themselves, maybe whereas an adult might be like, "Yeah, okay, whatever."
Mm,
Um, but I think that's great that you add that, I really like that.
thanks. Yeah. And do you want me to go to the next component, or do you wanna talk a little bit about some of
Um,
the research you found?
you can go ahead to the next component.
Okay. Okay, so the second component that Dr. Kristin Neff talks about is common humanity versus isolation,
Mm,
right? And so I love this component because it gets back to, well, honestly, so many of our episodes now, but in our very first episode that we did on You Are Not Alone, that was the whole basis of that episode was to talk about this idea that we are so much more alike than not
mhm,
when it comes to just our own, just our own humanness, right? Like our own mistakes, our own things that we're ashamed of, our secrets, all of those kind of things. And again, the stories are different, right? But the narratives are different, but these common themes just come up over and over again. And so I really resonate with this component of common humanity versus isolation because I think that it is so common for many of us, especially when we're down and out, to feel like I'm the only one,
mm,
right? Or no one else is experiencing what I'm experiencing. And self-compassion is actually rooted in our common humanity. And, so when we struggle or make mistakes, there is often an irrational but pervasive sense of isolation. And the practice of self-compassion really starts to move away from that. And so just this idea that I am not the only one in the world that has made this mistake
mhm,
can be very liberating, and again, put us in that space of kind of like, mm, expansion rather than constriction. And when I'm in a space of expansion, that's when I can actually learn from my mistakes.
right.
So I really love that one.
I think this one, it's really important. And I also think this one can be tricky for people. And again, kind of tying back to previous episodes, part of what I think you're asking, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in this component, i- it's kind of asking you to be vulnerable with yourself, not just with others. I mean, there's that can extend to others, but I think what often happens when, say, something happens and you're in that isolation mode, again, it's tunnel vision, and it's, this hasn't happened to anyone else, and, that's when we build up walls, and that's when our defenses go up. So we're also saying, "Okay, well, yes, this does happen to other people," which might mean we're also asking people to, let their defenses down a little bit, have some openness, and that can be, I think, really challenging. However, it can be very rewarding because, again, this is where growth happens. And I think, it's interesting because one of the words that's popping up for me right now is perfectionism. And I think part of what you're asking is people to realize, like you said in the beginning, that we make mistakes and we are not perfect. And so it's even sitting with that idea
Mhm.
can be really challenging, but I think it's very important because, again, that's opening that window or that door to let that self-compassion come in.
Absolutely, and you're right. I think there's a big connection between self-compassion and then this idea of perfectionism, and I know for me that, you know, I've mhm. Well, I've never considered myself actually to be a perfectionist, maybe in certain ways,
Mhm,
and we'll talk about that in another episode. But I think that this lack of self-compassion is could be easily connected to that strive for perfectionism that so many of us, I think, can relate to. So,
mhm. Yeah.
yeah, really important. So, Sarah, the third and final component that Kristin Neff discusses with self compassion, and I really love this one too, it is mindfulness. So, being mindful versus over identification.
Mm,
So, with this, I think, self compassion requires taking a balanced, mindful approach to our suffering, to
mhm,
our mistakes, so that we don't suppress it, right? We don't deny it, but we also don't exaggerate it. And we
mm,
don't become consumed by whatever our mistakes are. And I really love this idea. So mindfulness comes in because the practice of just being mindful with whatever is coming up for you in the moment kind of allows us to turn towards our pain with acceptance
mhm,
rather than, again, either complete denial of it, or in a lot of cases what I see with clients is an over identification with whatever they think where they're lacking,
okay.
right? And so it can almost they can start to feel consumed by this inner dialogue of how they're not good enough.
Mm. I'm just curious, do you have an example of a client that might have kind of gotten to the point of they're over identifying?
Sure. Yes. Yeah. So intrusive thoughts come up in a lot of clients. And a lot of the work that I find I do in session with clients tends to be around this idea of intrusive thoughts. And so
Okay.
really what an intrusive thought is an over-identification of a thought. So let me just think for a minute of one I can use, a real life example. Okay, so I have a client that is very fearful of public speaking,
Mhm.
and I'd say that's a fear that many of us can relate to. And I was so proud of him because he really wanted to overcome this fear, in part because his job, he was getting a promotion, and part of his job was going to require him to start speaking at meetings with a fair amount of employees. So he really wanted to get over this fear because he was so over identified with this idea that he was an awful public speaker.
Hmm.
He just so he became over identified it in the way that he was waking up in the morning thinking about it. He was headed to work thinking about it. He was going home at night fretting about it.
Okay.
And he did have one day he had to give a presentation and he fumbled it,
Mhm.
right? I won't go into detail about what happened, but he really felt like he he botched it.
Okay.
And he got feedback from his supervisor that it didn't go so well.
Mhm.
Okay. So all that did is make him become even more over identified with this idea that he was a bad public speaker. But he so rather than being able to maybe take a step back
Mhm.
and view his very human, right? Again, like such a human occurrence to have to get up in front of people and speak, and suddenly your throat gets so dry, you can't really talk, you fumble your words, it's such a human thing, but he had a very hard time kind of taking that balanced approach, right? Like
Okay.
that mindful approach to this, scenario.
Okay.
So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. Because I was going kind of in a different direction in my mind,
Mhm.
and I think you did a good job of kind of my I was thinking more in terms of when people get in that space of what's the word I'm looking for? What do you call it? Imposter syndrome.
Mm.
But I think your example is better because it sounds like it's all consuming versus when I see imposter syndrome, I see it happen in pockets, if you will. Like it happens, but then that's not a 24/7 kind of feeling. It's the person gets home and then they realize like, okay, my workday's done. And they're able to, maybe compartmentalize a little bit. But that was helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and there's so those are the 3 components. There's one other thing that I did wanna mention with this, and I'll be curious to hear if you have some thoughts on it, Sarah, is that so Kristin Neff came up with another term. I don't know if I would use this specifically, but I
Mhm.
do like the idea behind it. So she also teaches something called fierce self-compassion.
Okay.
And so what fierce self-compassion versus tender self-compassion is that I think there's this argument or maybe this myth or misunderstanding that if we're just practicing being compassionate with ourselves all day, like how are we going to be motivated to do anything? Like how are we going to be motivated to take action? Or if we're just always feeling so good about ourselves, does that mean that we don't take accountability for our
Mm.
mistakes? And that is not it at all. And so I just really wanted to point out that so so where this idea, this is her word again,
Mhm.
tender self-compassion simply means just like being with ourselves, allowing ourselves exactly as we are, not really changing anything, but just accepting it.
Mhm.
Fierce self-compassion is actually taking action. It's when we realize there's times when we do make mistakes that we need to take accountability for,
Mhm.
or we make mistakes that we don't want to happen in the future, so we make changes, right? So that that doesn't happen again. And so fierce self-compassion is really about taking action. It doesn't always just mean you sit back and just, "Oh, well," So, yeah, that was just the one other piece I thought was important to point out.
Yeah, that's interesting because that brings me up for thinking of 2 points. So,
Mhm.
one of the people that I came across in my research was Amy Finlay-Jones, and she too is an associate professor, she's a therapist, and that's her focus is self-compassion, mindfulness, and well-being. And she's got and when we get to more into some strategies, I'm gonna reference her again, but I listened to her was it I think she did a podcast with someone last month, or maybe it was February, but it was called We Are Human Leaders, and I'll put that too in the notes. But one thing that she said that really struck me is she says, "We don't have to like ourselves to practice self-compassion."
Mm.
And that to me, as soon as you were saying that fierce self-compassion and, it's about taking action, that's what it made me think of because a lot of times when people don't like themselves, that is almost like an excuse. It's like, "I don't deserve this, so I'm not gonna try," or
Ah.
something like that. And one of the things that I came across as well, and this really ties into that fierce self-compassion, is in terms of strategies, and this is a huge topic, but this is probably the best definition that I've seen of it's about forgiving yourself. And this is the first time I've actually seen it written out because people will say to me, "Well, how do I forgive myself?" And that generally is, a whole session worth of conversation. But this is broken out into a couple of steps. The first one is accepting responsibility,
Mm.
which goes back to that accountability piece.
Yeah.
The second is acknowledging the regret that you feel.
Mm.
The third is working on repairing the damage and then recommitting yourself to your personal values. And
Love it.
I do too. And as soon as you were talking about that, that's what I went to because I think that is so important. It's hard. But
Mhm.
again, if we're taking accountability, it does get easier.
Yeah, I love that, Sarah, and I love that even though we've been looking at 2 different people here that are experts on this topic, we really are on the same page.
Mhm.
So, yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
This isn't like a free pass, right? Like, to just do whatever you want in life and, I love myself, it's all okay."
I'm gonna go take a bubble bath now.
Right, right. Well, there's nothing wrong with a bubble bath, that's for sure,
True.
but I know in my own life, like, the mistakes that I've made, y you know, eh, really what I wanna do and I'm not perfect at this by any means, but I like to look at mistakes or failures or, whatever, those those flub ups that we all make as human beings as teachers, right? Like if there's some mistakes I make that are just like whatever, like it's just silly and it's fine to let it go. But there's other mistakes I've made in my life where I'm like, wow, okay, wait, I need to stop and really like shine the light on this because I don't want to go through this again. Right?
Mhm.
What can I learn from this? So
Right. Right.
so self-compassion is not all just like I don't even know the right word, but just like gentle and lovey. It's all it is those things, but then it's also okay, now I want to take action, right? So that I can learn and grow from this.
And I think it's about it's also about honesty because I think when we're
Mhm.
honest with ourselves, that's when we can, like you say, shine the
Yeah.
light and look and say, "Okay, let's be honest, like, I really screwed this up. I need to take, I need to, this is becoming a pattern, or this is a pattern. I have to change this. More importantly, I hope I want to change it, not that I'm doing
Mhm.
it for someone else. But I think the other part of that too is, and I don't know if this is, oh, I don't even know how to kind of go into this. What's coming up for me is it speaks to that idea of, what do I need? So it's a balance, right? Like it's that honesty of, okay, what do I need? But also, how do I do that in a kind way?
Hmm.
So if I need to, if I need to be healthier, so if I need to have a better exercise routine, am I going to do that and, you know, kind of push myself to the point that I can't move the next day? Or am I going to say, okay, let's work within what's in,
Yeah.
reasonable, and how do I keep going at it? If that makes sense.
Absolutely, it does.
Okay.
Yep. So we're taking maybe a more moderate approach in this example with the exercise. And you're right, because if we just went all in, if we go from not exercising at all to spending 3 hours in the gym, going full speed,
Right.
we're gonna be hurting the next
Right.
day, and we're probably not gonna wanna go back to that goal.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to mention too with Amy Finlay-Jones, she has a great resource on her website, and let me see if I can find it here. It's a packet, and she goes through, it's called the Self-Compassion Reset. And she's got, I don't know how many pages this is, but it's pretty cool because she's got kind of a step-by-step framework, and then at the back, she has, like, a practice journal. So what I tried, what I noticed, and it's broken out by day, and again, I'll include that for people to
Okay.
reference. But I liked the idea of whether it's, you use hers, you create something yourself, but it's that idea of looking at almost like the pros and cons. So what worked? What didn't work? One of the things I know we've talked about is in terms of gratitude, or, even that self-kindness, is focusing on your wins, those small accomplishments.
Mhm.
And again, even just doing that, it's still taking action, but it may not be that, brutal honesty, because you might not be ready to look at the flip side. But if you can say, "Hey, well, I did this today and I'm happy about that." It's finding wherever your place is to start, I guess.
Mm. I love it. I love it. Yep.
One of the things, and I don't know if you came across this in your research, but I kind of feel like, and if you don't wanna do this now, we don't have to, but I kind of was looking at or thinking about what are the benefits of self-compassion, because I think there's that idea like, "Oh, this would be good for me to do, but okay, I'm gonna be nicer to myself. What does that get me in the
Mhm.
long run?"
Mhm. Yeah, hmm. So I'll just share with you when you just asked that question, I'm gonna share the very first thing that popped up into my mind in terms of a benefit.
Mhm,
So, w w what immediately came up for me is that practicing self-compassion in a real, authentic, honest way, where we're being very loving to ourselves, but we're also really shining the light
mhm,
on where we may need to make changes. To me, then what occurs naturally is that we learn and we grow from our mistakes.
mm,
And I'm just such a huge that's just self-growth is just something that I have always been interested in, just expanding, growing. I don't like the idea of staying stagnant in my own life, like
mhm,
in my own inner life and outer life, but probably even more my own inner life. And so to me, practicing self-compassion actually leads to growth and learning.
mm,
Um, so that's what immediately came up for me. I know that's
okay.
kinda like a I know that's a broad that's like a broad answer, but I tend to be that kinda big picture person, so that's what came up.
No, I like that, and I agree with that. I think, much as you were saying that, I'm like, as soon as we stop growing, we're dead.
Mhm.
because we can always learn and we can always grow. I think to kind of drill down a little bit from that growth, some specific examples that I found, and I would agree, like, when I look at myself or when I think of clients that this is some of the work that we're doing, it builds resilience. If
Mhm.
especially if you're able to look at yourself and say, "Yes, this is working well, this isn't working well." When we take accountability, that allows us to reduce our insecurities. It may not feel like it in the
Yep.
moment,
Yep.
but bigger picture it does, and then it also, we can't in terms of blame, I think we're more realistic about it, and maybe blame doesn't even exist in that realm. I think it allows us to better handle setbacks and stress
Yep.
when
Yep.
it occurs. One of the things that and it was interesting because I also came across this whole idea of self-compassion in the business world, and when you're a leader, that's very important because if you can't do this with yourself, how are you gonna have a team that
Mm.
feels safe with you? They feel like they wanna do their jobs, they wanna come to work. And so if you're doing this for yourself and you're in any kind of leadership role or anything like that, self-compassion is gonna give you the ability to increase your collaboration and teamwork with others. It's gonna build trust. It's going to chances are you're also and I'm not saying people aren't purposely unethical, although that does happen, but
Mhm.
again, it's that honesty and it's that objectivity that basically it's increasing our integrity. So, and I
Yeah.
think the bottom line is, and I hope that if people out there, if you guys are practicing this, you're realizing your emotional regulation and your emotional intelligence is improving. It's increasing.
Mhm.
It's always interesting when I see posts around that in regards to the business world because I think that's great. It's important. But why would we not have that be our whole existence? Why would we
Yeah.
not apply that to other areas?
I love that, Sarah, and you know what? I'll just add something to that. So as you were just talking about self-compassion in relation to, like, leadership and leading, say, leading a team at work or
Mhm.
whatnot, I also just thought, and that also makes sense if you think about it, that not only, like, in the workplace, but in families, how right? Like, in family systems, how the practice if, like, let's say myself as a mother, if I'm practicing some of these things within myself, how I'm going to be naturally hopefully, I will be a role model, for example, to my son, who in the past, having autism and ADHD and anxiety, has been incredibly hard on himself.
Mm.
But one thing that I've noticed through the years is that because I'm role modeling so if I make a mistake with him, I admit it,
Mhm.
right? Like, I am going to go to him and say, "Bud, I'm sorry," right? Like, I just whatever it is, like, I snapped at you and I'm apologizing. I didn't get enough sleep last night or whatever. I'm kinda just making that up, but I'm sure something I'm sure a conversation like that has happened before with him. And what has occurred as he's gotten older is that he's started to adopt some of those same techniques or well, I shouldn't say techniques, but that lens to himself.
Mm.
And so now what he might say is he might say something like, "Ugh, mom, I don't hate myself, but I just hate what I did."
Nice.
Yeah, and it's like, because this is from a kid who used to he was incredibly hard on himself.
Mm.
So, anyway, I'm just sharing that, like, I love your example of how, we can't be good leaders if we're not practicing these things ourselves. And I would say too, within our family systems, if we practice these kind of things ourselves, it's amazing then the ripple effect I think it can have on other members of our family. Yeah.
Yes, agreed. Okay. Do you have anything else to add? Because I've kind of gone through, I think, the high points that I wanted to focus on.
Yeah, I not really. I think that because a lot of the strategies I think were kind of peppered throughout the episode.
Yeah.
The let's see, I'm just kind of looking at my notes. There's one last one I'll share, even though we kind of already mentioned it. And again, so this would be a strategy like if you're wanting to practice self compassion. So Kristin Neff talks a lot about exploring self compassion through writing or journaling.
Hmm.
And one idea that she gives is that, again, if you've made a mistake, that you sit down with pen and paper and just kind of uncensored you write about whatever issue it is that is making you feel inadequate or bad about yourself, and you kind of shine the light on what the emotions are that come up for you when you think about this aspect of yourself that you don't like. So the first part of this writing exercise is really just getting into the nitty-gritty of what is it that I'm not liking about myself or that I'm embarrassed about, or, so on and so on.
Hmm.
But then there's a part 2 to the exercise, and the part 2, and so this is now getting back to this idea of what would you say to a friend, or we kinda tweaked it to what would you say to a child. So part 2 is once you've done this kinda uncensored exploration of whatever it is that has you feeling badly about yourself, you write a letter to yourself from the perspective of a loving friend.
Mm.
And you kind of reflect upon what this friend says to you. Um, and so you're really like that practice, I think, is you're putting it into motion
Okay.
by writing this letter as if you were a friend. And it's a pretty powerful practice. I have done it before. And again, if we'll put in the show notes, like we'll have her website, and these practices that at least I'm talking about are all found on her website.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
So, Sarah, the last thing I will say is that listeners, you can stay tuned for our next episode, in which we delve into the topic of perfectionism. And I think that that topic will weave in very well with all the other episodes we've done to this point.
Agreed. That'll be a good one. I'm sure I'll have plenty of good examples for that one too.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, listeners, and thank you, Sarah. As always, be well, and we will talk to you next time.
Thanks, everyone. If you want to share your thoughts or ideas with us, you can email us at therapyunpluggedpodcast@proton.me. Until next time, be sure to subscribe to Therapy Unplugged on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere you get your podcasts.